Well, I'd like to welcome you all to our talk today. This presentation is being sponsored by the Center for the Study of Ethics in Society and also the Center for Women's Studies here at Western Michigan University. Our speaker today is Nancy Tuana. She's from the Department of Philosophy at the University of Oregon. She's the author of several books, one of them being The Less Noble Sex, Scientific, Religious, and Philosophical Conceptions of Women's Nature, and also the book Women and the History of Philosophy. She's also edited a number of anthologies, including one that I've used in my Philosophy 315 class called Feminism and Science, and I see several members of that class here in the audience today. She's also the editor of a 30-volume series called Rereading the Canon that's being published by Penn State Press. Now, the title of her talk today is going to be Revaluing Science, How Feminism Improves Science. I'd like to welcome Nancy Tuana.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a delight to be here with you today. What I'm going to do is start somewhat briefly by talking about what it is that we who are feminists are doing in our studies of science, and then share with you some of the work that I've been doing most recently in this area, in particular dealing with the question of values in science. One distinction that's helpful to understanding some of the concerns of feminists in our studies of science is a distinction that was originally made by Sandra Harding, and it's the distinction between the woman question in science and the science question in feminism. The woman question in science was one of the original questions that we started asking. We started asking it primarily around the question of why there were so few women in science. And this was a question we started asking in the early 70s. And it's not a question we've stopped asking because there are still areas of science, for example, physics and mathematics, where there are still very small numbers of women in science. In addition to asking the question of why there were so few women in science and looking, for example, at the ways in which there might be educational barriers and discriminatory hiring practices, we also started looking at the nature of scientific theorizing about women's nature. This was work that I contributed to in my early research. And as we started doing these two poles of our questioning of the woman question in science, we started seeing a possible intersection between why there might be so few women in science and scientific theories of women's nature. Because as we started looking at scientific theories of women's nature, one of the things we started noticing was a pattern that repeated itself throughout the history of Western science of women being seen as less capable of rationality, less capable of participating in the public realm. And indeed, looking at the ways in which the practice of science and the practice of the scientist was being constructed in ways that could be called masculine. In other words, the scientist was being defined as someone who had characteristics seen as masculine at that historical moment. So our questioning started opening up concerns in areas of epistemology, how it is that we know in science, as well as getting us involved in questions within the philosophy of science, not only in the ways in which science is practiced, but how it is that we're conceptualizing scientists. Which led us as feminists to begin to ask the question, what Sandra called the science question in feminism. In other words, what do we do about science? Do we as feminists reject science? Is it a masculine endeavor that is not salvageable, that we need to set aside? Or can we take science as it is currently practiced and improve that practice, get it to be less sexist, less racist, and so on? Or do we need to transform radically, more than just taking science as it's currently practiced and improving it a bit, transform the practice of science. In asking these questions, part of our concern was looking both at what we perceived as a systematic androcentrism in the history of science in terms of the theories of women, as well as the ways in which there seemed to be a problem in the participation of women in the sciences. And a variety of approaches developed out of this, approaches that worked along the three lines of attempting to accept scientific practice as it's currently engaged in and improve it to remove sexist biases from it, which was originally called feminist empiricism. A group of feminists who basically rejected science, saying that science would never be compatible with feminist concerns. And then a third group of feminists, originally standpoint perspectives that developed around the idea of using the experiences of women and other groups of people who had been traditionally excluded from the practice of science to begin to look at creating new ways of doing science, so that science would not simply be science as usual, quote unquote, cleaned up a bit, but an alternative practice of science. My work has been engaged in looking at the ways in which we can transform science. It's sort of a mid-position to continue engaging in some of science as we know it, but to be more aware of the biases and presuppositions that are a part of science and cannot be removed from science, to make sure that we are calling those very biases into question. And what I'd like to do with you today is share with you what my position is about the values of science, and what to do about a changing recognition, not only by feminists, but by many theorists of science, about the roles of values within science. 15 years ago, when I was giving lectures delineating sexist biases woven into the science of embryology, showing, for example, the ways in which social biases about women's roles, women were seen, for example, as being inferior to men, being weaker than men, being dependent, being passive, were mapped onto the metaphors, models, and experimental methods of sexual development. So, for example, I was studying the ways in which, if you looked at theories of embryology, you'd get narratives of heroic sperm that would fight against great odds to travel through hostile territory to get up to the prize, to defeat his rivals, marry the princess, and start a new society. And it was almost as literal as that if you looked at the narratives of the theories that were being developed historically. Now, when I developed these types of analyses of the models, metaphors, and experimental designs, after I gave my talk, there would be an interesting discussion that would occur when audience members would ask me a question, which was very difficult to deal with, namely, what was I proposing in terms of a new science? Were feminist studies of science, audience members asked, aiming at a value-free science? In other words, were our studies designed to reveal sexist and racist values so that those values could then be removed from science, namely science, values that accidentally crept into science, and here we come to clean them out? Or were we proposing that feminist values were better than sexist values? So what we wanted to do was replace our values with the previous values. This view, particularly the latter view, was a stumbling block for a long time within science studies, because the going view, the current view of science, was of a value-free science, which seemed to require a God's eye perspective from which scientists, the linkage between science and value was unacceptable. Yet this very attempt to make science value neutral was inconsistent with many of our philosophical, psychological, and scientific theories concerning perception and rationality. how could we be espousing a revalued science when science is supposed to be the pinnacle of objectivity, and when objectivity is being defined as being value-free? What we began to suspect, we who were working in science studies, particularly those of us working from a feminist perspective, was that the linkage between neutrality, between science being value-free and objectivity, was at root a confusion. That it's not necessary to be value-free in order to be objective. The idea of a value-free science is linked to the tenet that neither the individual beliefs or desires of a scientist nor the social values of a scientific community are relevant to the production of knowledge. And models of scientific method were constructed with the goal of factoring out such contaminating influences. The rapid militarization of science in the United States since the 1970s and the current rise of influence of venture capital in charting the direction of scientific research has made it increasingly difficult to draw any clear lines between a pure, disinterested science and a goal-oriented, transformative, applied science. Questions in the philosophy of science have shifted from pure epistemological questions, pure with scare quotes around it, such as how do we know, to questions that reflect the locations of science within society and the relationships between power and knowledge. We're now asking, for example, questions like, why do we know what we know? Why don't we know what we don't know? Who benefits or is disadvantaged by knowing what we know? Who benefits or is disadvantaged from what we don't know? Why is science practiced in the way that it is, and who is advantaged or disadvantaged by this approach? How might the practice of science be different? Feminist theorists of science have been active participants in this research program. Our work has added an important dimension to discourses concerning the value neutrality of science by focusing attention onto the dynamics of gender and oppression in the theories and methods of science. One of the central insights of feminist science studies has been the increased awareness of the ways in which social locations that include political and ethical dimensions, are gendered. Through this attention to gender, we have contributed to the transformation of the traditional question, how do we know, in numerous ways, including investigating whether traditional models of rationality and of the scientific method have been gender biased, that is, have privileged traits viewed as masculine and denigrated those perceived to be feminine, documenting the ways in which scientific theories have reinforced sexist and/or racist biases, delineating the ways in which men in dominant groups have benefited and have been hindered by questions asked and avoided in science, and analyzing the impact of the exclusion as well as the inclusion of women within science. An important resource for feminist investigations of science has been the practices of women scientists. Many feminist theorists, particularly those who embrace a feminist standpoint perspective, have argued that the distinctive experience of women in a gender-stratified society provide an important resource, a resource typically overlooked by non-feminist theorists, that, in the words of Sandra Harding, enables feminism to produce empirically more accurate descriptions and theoretically richer explanations than does conventional resources. One of my goals in my research and in what I'll be presenting to you today is to illustrate the ways in which the experiences of women, particularly women scientists, provide a resource for feminist critiques of the ideal of value neutrality in science. Women's differences, both their differences from men and their differences from one another, can highlight overlooked or minimized aspects of the knowledge process in science. Now, before I go on, I want to emphasize that when I talk about difference, I am not evoking some sort of biological essentialism here. What we're talking about are differences between men and women, as well as differences between groups of women that result from living in and being socialized in a gender and race and class stratified society. Okay, so it is not necessary to invoke a kind of biological essentialism to talk about differences between women and men. In my talk today, I will be looking at three things that we can learn from studying the practices of women scientists that affect the traditional epistemological question, how do we know? And involve the rejection of the idea of value neutrality in science. First, replacing the traditional model of the knower as a detached, disinterested individual with a dynamic model of engaged, committed individuals in communities as knowers. Two, the recognition of the epistemic value of affective processes, the importance of the emotions, for example, in the knowing process. And three, the examination of the role of the body in knowing. So I'll start off by questioning the traditional model of the individual as knower, as detached, disinterested. Descartes envisioned himself alone in his study, attempting to put aside all he had learned from authority and all the beliefs that he had unquestionably inherited from his culture, as well as endeavoring to suppress the needs of his body. Descartes believed that only after he had removed all such influences from his rational processes would he be capable of pursuing his method for gaining true knowledge, alone and unencumbered by others. Although Descartes is hardly an empiricist, it is a Cartesian subject that is designed to hold the subject position in traditional S knows that P models of knowledge. This is a model of knowledge that aims ideally at removing all individual traces of the knowing subject. Both perception and cognition are assumed to be invariant from knower to knower. All other factors, such as personal beliefs, desires, and bodily configurations, are deemed irrelevant at best, contaminating at worst. Based on this picture of rationality, much of modern epistemology has been focused on the ways in which variations between knowers could be filtered out. This model of the knowing subject is in tension with the feminist acknowledgement of the fact that as humans, we are always in relations of interdependence, and that these relations are crucial not simply for personal satisfaction, but also for moral, political, and scientific deliberation. In the words of Sheila Ben Habib, the self only becomes an I in a community of others who are also I's. Every act of self-reference expresses simultaneously the uniqueness and difference of the self, as well as the commonality amongst selves. A careful study of the actual practice of science also discloses a different model of the knowing subject, one that necessitates a rejection of the model of the isolated knower and replaces it with a dynamic model of individuals in communities. An examination of the complexities of the communities relevant to the production of knowledge in science also reveals that the production of good science does not require disinterested, dispassionate scientists. As Sandra Harding has convincingly argued, objectivity does not require value neutrality. A scientist's social locations can be epistemically significant to his or her practice of science. The ideal of a pure science, a science uninfluenced by values, and the scientist as a neutral recorder of facts are myths, ones that can be rejected without abandoning objectivity and without abandoning science. An example of this, I look to the development of Woman the Gatherer theories of human evolution. These have been the subject of much discussion in feminist science literature because this example is an excellent illustration of not only the inescapable fact of value within the construction of scientific theories, but also the potential epistemic significance of the various communities, including political communities, in which the knower participates. Feminist discussions of the epistemological significance of being a part of the feminist community have found the science of primatology to be particularly relevant due to the fact that its stories of human evolution arise out of origin myths. That is, accounts of the origins of the family, of the sexes and of their roles, as well as the divisions between human and non-human animals. In other words, accounts of human evolution wear the metaphysics of their authors on their sleeves, and thus provide clear accounts of the ways participation in alternative communities can be epistemically significant. To understand the androcentrism of traditional man-the-hunter accounts of evolution, we need only to attend to the respective roles of women and men. Man-the-hunter theories of human evolution attribute the evolution of Homo sapiens to those activities and behaviors engaged in and exhibited by male ancestors. Males, the explanation goes, having the important and dangerous task of hunting big animals to provide the central food source, invented not only tools, but also a social organization, including the development of language, that enabled them to do so most successfully. Hunting behavior is posited as the rudimentary beginnings of social and political organization. In a very real sense, and this is a quote from Washburn and Lancaster, quote, "In a very real sense, our intellect, interests, emotions, and basic social life all are evolutionary products of the success of the hunting adaptation. The biology, psychology, and customs that separate us from apes, all these we owe to hunters of times past." Such accounts do not omit women, but place them firmly at home. While men are out hunting, women are taking care of hearth and children, dependent upon men for subsistence and protection. Note the assumptions embedded in this account. Only male activities are depicted as skilled or socially oriented. Women's actions are represented as biologically oriented and based on, quote, nature. This definition of women's functions as natural curtails any analysis of them, such as their relation to the physical and social environments or the role they might play in determining our social arrangements. Men are depicted as actively transforming their nature, while women are portrayed as constrained by it. The alternative origin stories told by feminist primatologists transform women from a passive sexual resource for males to active agents and creators. The work of Linda Marie Fettigan, Sandra Blaffer-Hurdy, Lila Leibowitz, Sally Linton Slocum, Barbara Smuts, Shirley Strum, Nancy Tanner, and Adrienne Zillman, amongst others, began in the 1970s to transform the complexion of the accounts of the nature of women and men. One key to understanding the explosion of alternative images of women's natures lies in the women's movement of the 1960s that contested the definitions of women as the second sex, definitions that simultaneously relegated her role to the private realm of family while designating the public realm of culture and politics as that which makes one fully human. Feminist attention to perceptions of women's roles and of the linkages of women and nature provided the basis for a rethinking of evolution for a number of scientists. The anthropologist Sandy Linton Slocum, for example, in her 1970 essay, Woman the Gatherer, Male Bias in Anthropology, identified ways in which females were being obscured within evolutionary theories by the association of their actions with nature, and began to question the assumption that women's actions were unimportant because they were derived from instinct, and thus not relevant to the evolutionary process. Slocum's position was in turn developed by paleoanthropological research of Adrienne Zillman and Nancy Tanner. The shift of attention was the result not of any biological difference between women and men scientists, but because women scientists were more likely to be affected by and participate in a feminist community. A community that had been actively exposing the history and impact of androcentric bias of associating women with nature and men with culture, as well as working to revalue the socially defined work of women, including childcare and housework, as valuable work. This political awareness arising from the influences of the feminist community changed the focus of attention for researchers like Slocum, Tanner, Zillman, and contributed to the construction of alternative questions. But it would be inaccurate to see the accounts of these scientists as influenced only by their participation in communities that were redefining women's nature. These women were also influenced by their membership in scientific communities and the then current theories of evolution. The point is that accounts by women primatologists, particularly feminist primatologists, while marked both by their gender and by their politics, as they attempted to carve a role for women out of standard narratives of evolution, nevertheless evolved out of and are influenced by the accepted narratives and standards of evidence of their scientific communities. Nor should alternative evolutionary accounts such as Woman the Gatherer be seen simply as feminist correctives, that is, as an ideological image imposed onto the data. This alternative model of evolution arose in response to changes within the scientific community, provided more accurate accounts of the evidence, and was therefore a result of better science. But this is not incompatible with saying that the model emerged from the practice of feminist scientists who, because of the influence of their communities, attended differently to the data. To say that the practice of science is marked by gender and by politics is not the same as claiming that it arises out of wishful thinking or ideological concerns. A scientific theory can provide consistent methods for obtaining reliable knowledge, yet be influenced by certain values or interests. Objectivity and neutrality are not the same thing. Although it is an error to ignore the influence of the feminist community on Adrienne Zillman's development of Woman the Gatherer account, it is hardly the only or the most important community of which she was a part. Being a student of Washburn, she was influenced by his belief in a human-chimpanzee-gorilla divergence of only 5 million years rather than the previously accepted 20 million years. This allowed for an alternative perspective of the differences between chimpanzees and humans, one that saw them as less dramatic and emphasized continuities. To this, we must also add the work of Jane Goodall and her accounts of mother-infant relationships that evinced a heretofore neglected complexity and enlarged perspective of maternal investment, a model Zillman extended to hominid evolution. There are also numerous primate studies that resulted in modification of previous views concerning the passivity of female roles, including female sexual initiation of copulation and the roles of females in social dynamics. Other primate studies, for example, documented the use of tools by both sexes for gathering foods. Zillman's accounts were thus strongly influenced by contemporaneous scientific accounts, as well as by her participation in feminist communities. Based on chimpanzee studies of diet and tool use, Zillman denied the evolutionary importance of hunting as inscribed in Man the Hunter accounts. For similar reasons, she rejected a sharp division of labor between females and males, arguing that both sexes shared food gathering activities, and denounced the image of females as basically confined to a, quote, home base. However, Zillman focused on the intensification of the mother-infant bond resulting from increased infant dependency as a crucial element in human evolution, arguing that this change mandated both a greater need for regular food supplies to feed the infant and an increase in cooperation amongst individuals, resulting both in the development of increased social skills and in the selection of more socially skilled males by females. Woman the Gatherer accounts of human evolution were not reversals of Man the Hunter accounts, in which women were seen as the agents of evolution and men's activities are relegated to the realm of nature. Rather, Woman the Gatherer theories recast accounts of human evolution such that both female and male roles are seen as important, and did so primarily by denying radical differences between those roles. Previous accounts of human evolution had acknowledged gathering activities by women. What Zillman's accounts changed was the evolutionary importance of gathering activities. Previous accounts claimed that hunting was something new that accounted for evolutionary change. On Zillman's account, what counted for evolutionary change was extended gathering by women and men alike. Zillman depicted gathering activities as skilled and requiring a relatively large body of knowledge concerning which plants are edible. In other words, these activities are constructed as social and skilled rather than individual and unskilled. Hominid evolution arising from the increased importance of gathering is depicted as a central factor in the development of greater social skills, including communication, as well as the development of tools. Zillman thus depicts gathering as creating the conditions for the evolution of the importance of hunting, a conclusion which is actually more consistent with the archaeological evidence for hunting tools. What this example illustrates is the importance of beliefs acquired from one's participations in various communities for the development of knowledge. Zillman's creation of an alternative to the androcentric man the hunter theory was made possible by the knowledge she gained from the communities of which she was a member, in this case both scientific and non-scientific. However, it is not a coincidence that the Woman the Gatherer hypothesis was initiated by the work of Sally Linton Slocum and developed by Nancy Tanner and Adrienne Zillman. Being a feminist scientist can affect the practice of one's practice of science. In the words of Lynn Hankinson Nelson, it makes a difference to one's observations, appraisals of theories, and one's own theorizing if one recognizes androcentric and sexist assumptions, categories, or questions, and if one questions the inevitability of male dominance and/or the universality of hierarchical dominance relationships. In short, it makes a difference if one is working from a feminist perspective. But Zillman's participation within particular scientific communities is also a crucial factor in the development of her research. The point is that a scientist is simultaneously a member of a number of different epistemic communities and subcommunities. The values and beliefs of these various communities often interact in complex ways over the course of the knowledge process. Fully understanding the development of knowledge then requires an appreciation of the interactive effect of all relevant communities and an understanding of the underlying presuppositions, metaphysical as well as aesthetic and moral values of each community's systems of beliefs. Acknowledging that social values enter into the practice of science problematizes the traditional model of the knower as detached, disinterested, and autonomous. Both the individualism as well as the goal of neutrality posited by traditional accounts of knowledge must be questioned. Many feminist theorists of science contend that women's relative absence from the practice of science is not due simply to institutional barriers such as limited access to advanced science training, but is also an impact of a model of the scientist that privileges traits that have historically been associated with masculinity, traits such as being autonomous, detached, disinterested, and suppress those traditionally associated with femininity, namely dependent, connected, engaged. In other words, despite its professed neutrality, the positivist model of knowledge, like all models, arises out of a tradition and is imprinted with the values of that tradition. Neither science nor our models of science correspond to the neutrality ideal. Feminist studies of science thus reveal a myopia of traditional individualist accounts of the knowing subject. On the traditional S knows that P model of knowledge, we need have no knowledge of S. We need have no knowledge of the knower, the subject of knowledge. Knowers, while envisioned as distinct individuals, are not seen as distinctive. Neither the body nor any subjective aspect of an individual's mental activity is seen as affecting the proper pursuit of knowledge. The fact that I'm a woman, that I was raised working class, that I'm a faculty member, none of these are seen as having any connection whatsoever to my ability to know, and at best are seen as contaminating on the traditional model. This is a model of knowledge linked to the belief in a universal faculty of reason that is common to all human beings at all times and is not affected by our individual differences. This is a model that embraces the vision of the generic, quote, man, a sameness that removes the threat of allegedly biased or partial perspectives. Feminist investigations of science are resulting in a strategy of changing the subject of knowledge. We are finding that the traditional models of knowledge are inadequate to the actual practice of science and to the actual experience of knowing. The conception of the subject as generic and hence not itself a subject of study does not fit the epistemic importance of differences between subjects. Such a model, for example, does not account for the epistemic role of the complex relationships between agents of knowledge, as evinced in examples like that of women the gatherer theories of human evolution. Equally problematic, this model overlooks the epistemic significance of subjective aspects of the relationship between scientists and the subject of inquiry, such as the scientist's commitments, desires, and interests. It also ignores the fact and nature of a scientist's embodiment. We are, after all within a particular body. In this section, I examine the role of what has traditionally been called the passions in the knowledge process in science. Evelyn Fox Keller offers a portrait of the geneticist Barbara McClintock that provides a very different image of the scientist than that of a disinterested, detached observer. McClintock describes herself as having developed a close relationship with the objects of her investigation. I start with the seedlings of maize. I don't want to leave it. I don't feel I really know the story if I don't watch the plant all the way along. I know every plant in the field. I know them intimately, and I find it a great pleasure to know them. McClintock viewed the complexity of nature as being beyond full human comprehension. Organisms can do all types of things, she says. They do fantastic things. They do everything that we do, and they do it better, more efficiently, more marvelously. Trying to make everything fit into a set dogma won't work. There's no such thing as a central dogma into which everything will fit. In holding to this belief, a metaphysical value, McClintock deviated from the positivist assumption, yet another metaphysical value, that there were underlying regularities of nature, the laws of nature, that were discrete and individually knowable by humans. This difference in basic values contributed to McClintock's commitment of developing a close relationship with the material she was studying. For only by listening carefully can one, according to McClintock, let the material tell you. Quote, I feel that much of the work in science is done because one wants to impose an answer on it. They have the answer ready, and they know what they want the material to tell them. Anything else it tells them, they don't really recognize as there, or they think it's a mistake and they throw it out. If you will only just let the material tell you. McClintock's respect for the complexity of nature and her desire to listen carefully led her to embrace a close relationship with the maize she studied. Rather than shifting the job of planting and tending the maize to an assistant, she saw these activities as a crucial part of a process of understanding. In fact, she was proud of the fact that she came to know her plants so intimately she could predict the structure of the cell's nuclei from the external traits of plants. Before examining chromosomes, I went through the field and made my guess for every plant as to what kinds of rings it would have, and I never made a mistake. McClintock's emphasis on nature's complexity led her to the belief that scientists must at all costs take time and look. At a time when many other scientists abandoned the slow-growing maize for the quickly reproducing Drosophila, McClintock's attention to complexity and the related need for time to look made her conclude that corn's 2 crops per year was too much. To have time to analyze all there was to see, McClintock found that 1 crop a year was all she could manage. McClintock's values, particularly her belief in nature's complexity and the corresponding method of taking time to look, resulted in her being particularly sensitive to difference. Rather than minimizing anomalies, McClintock believed that they were there to be listened to carefully. For by finding out why they don't fit the model, one is challenged to develop a more complex model which will account for them. This model led her to criticize the emphasis on quantitative analysis in science, arguing that the focus on making everything numerical often resulted in overlooking what was different. Her method was, quote, to see one kernel of corn that was different and to make that understandable. Part of her method of letting the material tell you was this attention to difference. So if the material tells you it may be this, allow that. Don't turn it aside and call it an exception, an aberration, a contaminant. That's what happened all the way along the line with so many good cases. McClintock's description of the process of observation reads very different from accounts of detached, disinterested observers. And this is from her own account. I found the more I worked with them, the bigger and bigger the chromosomes got. And when I was really working with them, I wasn't outside. I was down there. I was part of the system. I was right down there with them, and everything got big. I was able to see the internal parts of the chromosomes. Actually, everything was there. It surprised me because I actually felt I was right down there, and these were my friends. In addition to her admonition to take time to listen, to develop an intimate relationship with the subject of study, McClintock's approach was a blend of reason and passion. Explaining why she was so convinced of the accuracy of her theory at a time when other scientists were rejecting it as untenable, McClintock explained the logic was compelling. The logic made itself. The logic was it. What's compelling in these cases is that the problem is sharp and clear. The problem is not something that's ordinary, but it fits into the whole picture, and you begin to look at it as a whole. It's just a stage. It isn't just a stage of this or that. It's what goes on in the whole cycle. So you get a feeling for the whole situation, which this is only a component part. According to Keller, what is significant about McClintock's method and constitutes the wellspring of her powers as a scientist is the intimacy of the relationship she develops with the object she is studying, a relationship that requires empathy and cultivated attentiveness. Feminist studies of science, particularly the detailed studies of the practices of women scientists, have served as an important resource for feminist epistemologists. Influenced by examples like that of Barbara McClintock, which I just shared with you, many feminists are developing epistemologies that include the tenet that subjectivity is an important and indispensable component of gaining knowledge. But successfully doing so requires offering alternative models of knowledge. Ones like that offered by Lorraine Code, a model of knowledge that she calls knowing other people. While S knows that P models of knowledge are based on what Code calls ordinary knowledge of medium-sized objects in the immediate environment, the book, the door, Code's model is based on the centrality of our relationships with others. Developmentally, recognizing other people, learning what can be expected of them, is both one of the first and one of the most essential kinds of knowledge a child obtains. Code presents this model as an addition to S knows that P epistemologies that perhaps work for simple objects in simple settings. She argues that the latter model is not sufficient for more complex instances in which knowledge requires constant learning, is open to interpretation at various levels, admits of degrees, and is not primarily propositional. For such cases, a standard of knowledge modeled after our knowledge of other people, a model of knowledge that would give us a model for how we know the world, particularly how we know the world in science, modeled along our knowledge of other people, she's arguing would be more accurate and more helpful than the traditional epistemological model. What we're beginning to do is argue for a remapping of the epistemic terrain, a model that posits other people, knowing other people, as a paradigmatic kind of knowing challenges the desirability or even the possibility of a disinterested, dislocated view from nowhere. A model of knowing other people is a dynamic, interactive model. It is a vision of a process of coming to know that requires constant learning, constant responding to, constant interpretation. It is a model that admits of degrees, that is not fixed or complete, and that is not primarily propositional. Okay? It is also a knowing how, not just a knowing that. It's also tied in with the skills that we have as scientists and as knowers in the world. It's a model that embraces the subjective components of the knowledge process as illustrated in McClintock's method. McClintock's desire to develop an intimate relationship with the subject of her study, to take time to listen, to get right down there, to develop a feeling for the organism are all aspects of the knowledge process accounted for by an alternative model, like that of knowing other people. Rocks, cells, and scientists are located in multiple relations to one another, all of which are open to analysis and critique. Singling out and privileging the asymmetrical observer-observed relationship is but one possibility. This alternative model is a model that embraces McClintock's metaphysical belief that nature, like other people, is far too complex to allow for complete and universal knowledge. For McClintock, our knowledge of nature will always be partial, always changing, always in process, just as is our knowledge of people. This is not a critique or belittlement of our knowledge capacities, but rather a recognition and appreciation of the extraordinary complexity and continual evolution of both nature and of people. Such recognition leads to a model of knowledge that embraces the importance of empathy and imagination as a resource for letting the material tell you. It is a model that, while acknowledging the importance of categories and theories, does not privilege them over and above the importance of listening attentively and responsibly to the stories told to us, accounting for differences rather than imposing a model upon the world. Coates' point, and one that is shared by many feminist epistemologists, is that the traditional image of the dispassionate scientist removed from her or his object of study has blinded us to the complexity of possible relationships between subjects and objects. McClintock gained her knowledge because of her engaged relationship with the object of her study. That is, her fascination with maize is epistemically significant. She is drawn to it not just to predict the genetic patterns, but because she desires a full understanding of the organism in all its stages. When she refers to her study of maize, she does so with affection. These were my friends. Code posits nothing like an essential femininity that entails all and only women will embrace an engaged style of the knowledge production. She argues rather that McClintock's femaleness is simply one aspect of a complex conjunction of subjective factors at play in her practice of science. The goal of feminist epistemologists is to open epistemology and science education and practice to the importance of such subjective features, and to argue that our traditional models of scientific knowledge are inadequate to the complexity of knowing. We desire to reclaim subjective aspects of the knowledge process, components often defined as feminine and suppressed from traditional accounts, not to create a feminine science or even a feminist science, but to make a space in scientific research for suppressed practices and values that coincidentally or otherwise are commonly associated with feminine. Our rejection of this supposedly generic knower requires that attention be paid to characteristics and situation of the knower as an important part of the knowledge process, that the communities I'm a part of may indeed be epistemically significant, that my social locations, including the nature of my body, may indeed be epistemically significant. As illustrated in the example of Silman's practice of science, the various communities of which one is a part, including one's political beliefs, can be epistemically significant to the knowledge process. And as we see with McClintock, a knower's emotive capacities and her or his openness to the relevance of the knowing process can also be epistemically significant. This is why we are claiming that a person's gender can be epistemically significant. In contemporary Western culture, one who is female is more likely than one who is male to be socialized in such a way as to make her more proficient in and accepting of the usefulness of emotions such as empathy and imagination. Just as a feminist is more likely to question the categorization of female activities as natural and male activities as cultural, a woman in contemporary culture is more likely to be accepting of and skilled in the employment of emotions in the knowledge process. This is how our differences may be epistemically significant. But an additional aspect of the knowing subject that is epistemically significant is the fact of our embodiment. The model of the generic knower has traditionally rejected the relevance of our bodily differences. Attention to the body calls attention to the specificities and partialities of human knowledge, as well as reminding us of the importance of acknowledging the body and its variations in the knowledge process. Once we admit the body into our theories of knowledge, we must also recognize its variations. We must, for example, examine the ways in which bodies are sexed. And I'm not going to develop my arguments about bodies so that I can close up and allow time for discussion. But I would like to say that one of the things I'm trying to do in my research is offer an alternative model of knowledge or actually an alternative model of the scientific practitioner that is more analogous to the model of the primary care health practitioner, in which there's a blending of not only objective knowledge, but subjective knowledge, including the importance of touch and the skills of the body in the knowledge process. But let me close by mentioning the ways in which this study and others like it serve as case models of the very model of knowledge that I'm talking about, and that feminist epistemologists and philosophers of science are trying to provide as an alternative to traditional disinterested models of knowledge. Much of feminist scholarship and practice over the last 2 decades has been devoted to revaluing the importance of interpersonal relationships. Many feminist political theorists have argued that we must revalue the so-called private realm of relationships. Psychoanalytic feminists have called attention to the centrality of interpersonal relationships in the development of our personalities, our genders, and our desires. Feminist ethicists have offered and examined an ethics of care in which moral action is intimately linked to our relationships with others. Add to this the fact that women's prescribed social role of primary caretakers of children, of the elderly, and of the ill contributes to a heightened sensitivity to the fact and the importance of our essential relationality and of our embodiment. And it should be no surprise that it is feminist philosophers of science and epistemologists who are perhaps most vociferously rejecting the Cartesian model of the isolated knowing subject and replacing it with models that emphasize the centrality of our relationships with others to the process of knowing. I and many other feminists came to positions like these because of our participation in feminist communities. This obviously was not the only epistemologically significant community. We are also philosophers, historians, sociologists, and scientists. Nor does it mean that only feminists will hold such views. There are other theorists of science who do not participate in feminist communities who argue for versions of the above tenets. But a difference of feminist analyses is a persistent attention to gender as a variable of analysis. This is how our feminism is epistemically significant. What feminist epistemologists have realized is that it is a mistake to ask for a value-free science. As illustrated in the example of McClintock's feeling for the organism, the development of knowledge, including scientific knowledge, is affectively influenced. As the example of primatology illustrates, we cannot treat politics as inherently distorting the practice of science. Scientific research, as well as other cognitive endeavors, begins with metaphysical and methodological commitments. It arises out of and is conditioned by our participation in various epistemic communities. Each of us, in being part of a community and a number of sub-communities, participates in an evolving conceptual scheme that makes intersubjective experience possible, influences our interests and desires, and also sets the standards of what constitutes evidence. The acceptance of the essentially relational nature of knowledge and the inseparability of subjective and objective components of knowledge does not result in relativism, nor does it require an abandonment of the traditional view from nowhere conception, though it does require an abandonment of the traditional view from nowhere conception of objectivity. What it requires is an alternative notion of objectivity. And this has been the research program of many of us, both within feminist philosophies of science and epistemologies, as well as others within sociology of scientific knowledge programs, people who are working out of the sociology of science. Another way that the development of feminist epistemologies are compatible with the model that I've offered in this paper is that although there are significant differences between feminist epistemologists, we're offering different models, one common tenet is the emphasis on diversity within the scientific community to ensure objectivity. To cite one of just many possible examples, I'll give you a quote from Helen Longino's recent article. Quote, because background assumptions can be and most frequently are invisible to the members of the scientific community for which they are background, and because unreflective acceptance of such assumptions can come to define what it is to be a member of such community, thus making criticism impossible, effective criticism of background assumptions requires the presence and expression of alternative points of view. This sort of account allows us to see how social values and interests can become enshrined in otherwise acceptable research programs, i.e. research programs that strive for empirical adequacy and engage in criticism. As long as representatives of alternative points of view are not included in the community, shared values will not be identified as shaping observation or reasoning. Once again, we see the impact of the politics of feminism upon the development of feminist epistemology. For a central emphasis of feminism in the last couple of decades has been the importance of the inclusion of previously excluded groups and viewpoints. Earlier feminist accounts focused on the impact of including women and attention to gender upon society, scholarly methods, politics, and so on. The last decade has intensified this commitment as feminists have become aware of the differences between women and have acknowledged the ways in which attention to factors such as class, race, and sexuality, as well as gender, reveals previously hidden assumptions and opens up new research programs. Feminist philosophers of science have thus actively developed research programs consistent with the values and commitments we express in the rest of our lives. In this sense, we are creating feminist sciences, the doing of science from the politics of feminism. We also acknowledge the need for science to be open to diverse groups of individuals and to have these groups engage in what Longino calls an interactive dialogic community. This is not a simple pluralism, but one in which critical interchange between communities is highly valued. This, of course, does not mean that, quote, anything goes, to misuse that phrase that Feyerabend used so often. Although scientific standards are not seen as unchanging or unresponsive to such critical interaction, they do provide standards for acceptability. The woman the gatherer model in human evolution studies arises out of a feminist political agenda, yet meets the standards set by the field in which it is proposed, and this is important. Only if these alternative models receive a hearing within the scientific community will they ever secure serious attention. A value implicit in this vision of science is that the best form of science will be that which is the product of the most inclusive scientific community. This suggests that the problem of developing a new science is the problem of creating a new social and political reality. Thank you. That's fine.
Something you said here just towards the end, I've had a kind of question that was been floating through, you know, as you were going, and you began to approach it here at the end, I think. To what extent, I guess initially you posed the various groups here as kind of more radical change or tinkering, and yourself someplace sort of in between the tinkering and a revolutionary or a more substantial change. And yet it still sort of sounds to me like it's closer to the tinkering. Right, I mean, and again, here at the end, you were kind of suggesting that it's by bringing in more different groups with different backgrounds, we have more sensitivities to various biases and so on, and given the additional sensitivities to biases, what we're getting is greater objectivity, and that we're still looking for good science by more or less the same standards that we've been articulating. And so, again, it sounds more like what we're doing is cleaning up our act than really proposing a different act.
Well, there are two things that happen. One that happens when you start to bring in alternative members of the community, members that had been excluded in the past, is that you not only look at the values that are present in the practice of science, you also look at the values that are present in the standards of acceptability of science, as well as what science is aiming at and how it's being practiced. So that there are multiple levels at which the new dialogic community would be participating in. So it becomes then an open question as to how radical the changes will be in science. It's something that I don't think we can answer from right here. My view is that we actually have to engage in the questioning, and we have to engage in the examination not only of facts and approaches within science, but also the standards of science, before we can decide how radical the revisions will be. But it's definitely clear that one of the additional communities that are being suggested are alternative practices of science. For example, work that I didn't include in here is work coming from a feminist perspective, which questions the distinction between science, namely that stuff we do here in the West, and ethnosciences, namely pseudosciences practiced in other countries. One of the realizations that has arisen out of feminist as well as sociological studies of science is the ways in which there isn't a sharp distinction between this universal science and these others practical located sciences. That we need not only to look at the ways in which our science is an ethnoscience, that it's influenced by and emerging out of the values of our society, but in including additional people within this scientific community is to include people from alternative scientific practices, to look at the ways in which our scientific practices and standards open up certain realms but also close down other realms. So the quote-unquote possible radicalness comes in along that direction too, because what's open to potential change is not only the values that we hold in our practice of science, but the meta-values behind the doing of science.
Just one more twist.
Go ahead.
But in effect, aren't you giving me the same kind of answer now applied over there? When we're looking at these meta values, what we need to do is bring more people into it so that we can cancel out the biases. And
Oh, no,
we're
you
still-
don't. You don't cancel out the biases. One of the
But
things
it's a
that I'm
different
real
move than we're making before.
right,
We're bringing in the
very
biases.
different. What my position is, and the position of a lot of feminist epistemologists, not all, but a lot, and not just us, because if you look, for example, the work of Saul Restivo, he's also arguing this in the same way, more from a weak program in SSK. Our view is that you cannot remove biases. As human beings, we always will know from a position of, as Gadamer would say, prejudgment or prejudice. What we want to do is to have alternative prejudgments, alternative values available so that we can both be aware of and critically evaluate the values that we're using, the biases that we're bringing into science. One of the things that we're arguing against is the view that the reason why you can't let values into science is because they will make science irrational because they can't be evaluated. What we're arguing is that they can be evaluated and they can be to some extent empirically evaluated, but they can only be empirically evaluated if we can identify them and compare them to the effects of alternative value systems. So that's the role. The way, and this is still progressing, the way that Sandra Harding phrases it is the development not of good science, but the development of less partial, less biased science. The phrase I think I'm more comfortable with, rather than that, is the practice of scientists, the practice of science with values that we have critically evaluated and have taken responsibility for. Okay? I'm not convinced, as is Sandra, that we really can't, this notion of less biased, less partial, I'm not so sure about that because it still seems to follow along that traditional epistemological model that you can have more or less bias. But I do think that what we have to do is start bringing in the notion of responsibility and looking at the construction of norms within science and understanding the role between the construction of those norms and power relationships within society.
So when we, just last one, when we do this critical evaluation of the different values that are brought in, that's what you're suggesting here, right? Are we doing this critical evaluation in terms of our kind of old notion of objectivity or a different notion of, do I like the values? Right? I mean, that there are better and worse values that we are trying to have brought into the process or taken out of the process.
What I would say is we do it from a very complex Foucauldian position in which we recognize that the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity is unacceptable. That, in other words, that division falls, which is one of the things I'm arguing for in this paper. And that what are norms, what we consider to be better values, are in part arising out of a variety of different practices that we engage in society. That we can't simply isolate out our practices of science and say, let's look at the values that are arising out of our practices of science. But we need to recognize that our norms in science are connected to our norms outside of science. So that we can't continue to, the old view of philosophy was that, there's a hierarchy. Philosophy of science is the pinnacle and then epistemology, or sometimes they'd switch that around and have epistemology as a pinnacle and then philosophy of science. And ethics and aesthetics are way down here because they're so subjective and you can't really develop them out. What we're seeing now is that you can't separate those out in philosophy nor in our knowledge processes in general. So that the question, of course, is, well, whose values and who gets to decide? And that's exactly why we're arguing for a pluralistic society. And what we're recognizing is that this model isn't going to fall into place without radical changes within society. As long as we have a hierarchically organized, power imbalanced society, we're also going to not have full participation in the decisions about which values we want to follow. But we see this as a constantly evolving process. It's not as if there are good values, someday we'll find them, and then we can finally do science better. But what is a good value arises out of a set of practices and out of a social location and out of the material conditions of that location. So it's a question we will constantly have to ask. This will be a process we will constantly go through. It's a very complicated interpretive process. So in that respect, it's a very different model than the old view of objectivity. Each of us, various people have different words, like Sandra Harding wants to resuscitate objectivity, but she refers to it as strength and objectivity. Mine is rationality. I want to keep the word, but I want a much enriched notion of it that includes the body as well as subjective components. She had a question?
I appreciate your idea of incorporating a subjective approach to science and moving away from the cold and detached masculine approach. But don't you think someone making friends with their corn is going to a dangerous extreme?
Of course, if you don't have a balance, it may cause problems. But what we have to ask is, what can we gather? What can we gain from making friends with corn? And how does it affect differently how we go about knowing? And how will it affect the kinds of questions that we ask? And that's part of what we're trying to look at. That in the process of looking differently and offering different models, we're trying to understand the way our biases about what is and isn't acceptable, like, isn't it really going to extreme to make friends with your corn? Well, why? I mean, why? Well, part of why it seems like such an extreme is because one of the things that we get taught on the traditional model is that the world is out there, it's fixed, and we are able to uncover its secrets. But if we switch to an epistemology which suggests that there is a very complicated interpretive process that goes on between the world out there and us as knowers. In other words, that the questions we ask of the world determines what they answer back to us, and that we'll get different answers depending on what questions we ask. And indeed, that the way in which we go about asking our questions literally affects the world, that there's a constitutive component of this process of asking questions. Then we start to get a model that's more like, remember this is a metaphor, we get a model that's more like how you interact with a person. Because when I interact with you, what do I expect? I expect, first of all, that there's a lot there to know. I also assume that certain ways of my interacting with you may affect you. I mean, I may make you angry, may make you happy, so on and so forth. But that there's that, and that I can't have a fixed and forever knowledge of you, because not only are you growing as a person, our relationship is changing. If you take that metaphorically and shift it over to our knowledge of the world, you do get an enriched model that has a very different sense of epistemology behind it. Okay, so remember, it's a metaphor. Don't take it completely literally, but take it seriously in terms of what's behind it. And what you see behind it with McClintock is this appreciation of the complexity of the world and the way in which there's this rich interpretive dialogue between her and the world. It's not this dead, fixed organism she can just unpeel. You had a question, and then you.
Yes. Would you object to a kind of traditional way of trying to interpret this? That is, the values you're talking about are important, but they're actually instrumental values. For example, being friendly with your corn or being empathetic about studying it is actually a very important way in which you actually get to do good science and observe real distinctions between some species of corn which you otherwise would not notice. And therefore, sure, it is a value, but it's an instrumental value towards the end of objectivity in science. So in other words, and that might go along with the idea that empathy as such is not a feminine or a masculine trait. It's simply an important thing we should encourage in all scientists, maybe, because it has a great instrumental value in the traditional ideals of being a good scientist.
Well, one of the latter part of your statement I'm very comfortable with. I am not arguing, nor are many feminist epistemologists, that these are traits that I'm capable of and you absolutely are not, okay? Because I'm a woman and you're a man. What we're arguing is that these are traits that have been neglected, perhaps not coincidentally, and traits that also, not all of them, but many of them have been associated with femininity, which is a construct, not a biological fact. So we're very much saying we're trying to develop an alternative model, that it's a model for scientists, not just for women scientists. My problem is with the distinction, as if you can get a distinction between instrumental and non-instrumental values. There's where I have my problem, because I think that, mind you, I am working from an epistemology, and I've tried to give some evidence for that, but it's a much bigger argument than I can provide here. I am arguing for a richly hermeneutical model of knowing, that we cannot obtain objectivity in the traditional sense because we can never completely separate our values off. So these are more than instrumental values. They're also constitutive values. They will affect the kind of knowledge that we gain about the world, and will affect the world, and will affect who we are and how we know. Okay, so there's where I'll disagree. You had a question, and then him, and then you.
Yeah, your characterization of McClintock is obviously very, very different from, typically how society would perceive of a scientist and a scientific endeavor. I'm just curious, are you claiming that McClintock is really fairly unusual? Because I think most organismal biologists that I know possess the kind of passion about what they're studying that you described with her. So I was just curious.
What I'm quite convinced by is that our science education is problematic because it doesn't encourage affective components of the scientific process. I think that many scientists are able to overcome their science education. But I also think that it's a problem, it's a double problem. One, that it's not encouraged in the education, it's not a part of the model, it's seen as best as an instrumental value, one that ultimately you have to put aside because obviously you may have a passion for your science, but it's got to be replicated by people who don't have that kind of passion to make sure that it's not your politics getting in the way and creating bad science. So the model is still not fully recognizing the importance of these values. And I would argue that because it doesn't, we don't structure our science education to develop these characteristics in our scientists. So I have a real concern about that. And I think that one of the things we need to do is to engage in these kinds of studies of the actual practice of science, to show that these are components of science, of good science, okay? Because the assumption is to the extent that your values and your passions are getting into your science and can't be then somehow cleaned up at a later point, to that extent it's contaminating. And I think that's creating a bad model for science and a model that's creating an unhappy educational process.
Sounds like these values are more time consuming. What if time is a concern? Like you talk about.
Like you want to get tenure?
There's bigger concerns than that. I mean, if you're doing
Absolutely.
research like cancer research or
Absolutely.
research, time is a concern. People are dying while you're taking time to be friendly with. I mean, you can make that.
That's right.
What if time is a concern?
Well, you have to ask a multiplicity of questions because it's already the case that there are lots of values involved in science that you as a scientist are going to have to make some decisions about. So, for example, many scientists have to make decisions about whether or not they're going to do cancer research that is funded by drug companies, that is going to only allow them to do research directed in a certain way, that will look at the ways, Proctor's book is all about this, which will fund you only to do research on the ways in which there are genetic components of cancer and ways to modify the genetic organism, as opposed to looking at the ways in which the environment is implicated in cases of cancer. So one of the concerns is, well, yes, it may take more time, but ultimately we may get a better picture of it. If we keep focusing on this internal but genetic model and don't pay attention to environmental influences, either because of where our funding is coming from or because we're in a hurry, we may ultimately slow ourselves down. So, yes, of course you have to balance. But you also have to take responsibility and look at where sources of authority are, to look at the way that where funding is coming and how that's affecting the kinds of questions we ask, and to, as scientists, be responsible, which is something that has only recently been asked of scientists, that they take responsibility for what they do. It does take more time. You have the next question, then you.
Okay, three things. First of all, it seems to me that the current traditional methodology of science is very time-consuming with the demands of reproducibility and so on. Second of all, basically what you're saying is that it's because we can't eliminate biases, the real reason to bring in all these different sets of biases is just to illuminate them so we know that they're there.
And to choose to consciously choose the ones we want to practice, and to know what impact they'll have, and to make sure that, as best we can, to take responsibility for those and for their implications. Yeah. But I definitely have a model of knowledge which sees our interactions with the world as, you can see an uncertainty principle or a Bohrian view of the world as open, fluid, flexible, in process. You could see it as a process metaphysic too, and one in which we are part of that world and in interacting with it affect that world. So we need a much more complicated model of knowledge. But you can have all that without including what has traditionally been carved off as subjective components of knowledge. What we're also trying to bring back in is that the distinction between objectivity and subjectivity is a false distinction. Okay? And the equation of rationality with objectivity and irrationality with subjectivity. We're trying to suggest that part of being rational is using your emotions in certain ways, having certain skills that are embodied in your fingertips or in your ears is part of being rational. Okay? So we're trying to open up all of that. That's a whole bunch that I didn't have much time to map out. But it's a really exciting area, so I can give you about 20 books to read if you're interested. You had a question.
I'm confused still on a fairly basic level. Would you say that a given scientific truth or piece of scientific knowledge is created by scientists or discovered by scientists?
How about we don't make the distinction and we recognize that it's a bit of both? That it's an interactive process that is constitutive, but we are interacting with the world, so it's not completely constitutive. Okay, I'm not willing to go either side. I mean, basically the division is the old division of logical positivism versus, this is unfair. I did this in my class this quarter, and I know it's unfair, and so, he's turning over in his grave, but it's fire oven, where it's just, we just make the world in our image, and that's unfair to fire oven, but it's that distinction between radical social constructivism and the logical positive model of discovery. I think that that's another one of those distinctions that's a false distinction. And that's part of why I have a hermeneutical model richly embedded in here, because there is a world out there which I am a part of that I'm interacting with. But the ways in which I interact with it affect, in a constitutive fashion, the nature of the world as well as me. I'm affected by my interactions with the world, and I am different because of those interactions. So it's the model. This actually Kuhn started to break down the model of the difference between discovery and creation, and I'm very much arguing that we need to do that in a very rich sense. We need a very different epistemology, and it's not an easy one to develop. It's a much more complicated epistemology.
I hear you honoring the so-called second wave feminists of the 60s and 70s as well as the postmodern or the third wave feminists. I hear you honoring both in your work. Can you speak a little bit to the dichotomies that are in the criticisms that are coming from the second wave to the third wave, saying the attention is on the diversities and we need to unify in order to have just a unified picture looking at these issues?
So what you want me to speak to is sort of third wave concerns around diversity?
Well, or second wave criticism of
The attention.
way, saying, we're too busy looking at who
Right.
we are, we're not looking at the corn. Our focus is in the wrong place, would be the second wave criticism of third wave diversity.
Okay, so let me see if I can translate this into something that I can understand. So the sort of postmodern deconstruction of the category of woman, arguing that we as feminists can't continue, that we have to become post-feminist because we can't continue to use a category that is itself implicated in modernism and carries all of those categories, so that we have to work with something like nomadic subjects or difference, whatever, and the sort of counterattack of other feminists that no, despite our differences, there are still connections amongst us that are important. I think that what I would say is that I would point to I would use a Wittgensteinian notion of family resemblances and not try to claim that there is one thing named that is, or one set of things that's associated with being a woman that unifies women across their differences. But there's a family of resemblances, a variety of different things, and we link in different ways depending on what social strata we're from, what country we're from, so on and so forth. And that the importance is creating alliances which will enable us to discover both our similarities as well as our differences. So, for example, following along the line of Adrienne Rich's earlier book, the distinction between the institutions and the experience of mothering. The institutions of mothering aren't fixed either, but you'll find lots of commonalities between ideologies of motherhood in various different countries as well as along social strata, but you'll also see differences as well as similarities in experiences. So I think what we need is not to find the same thing between us, but to create alliances between different groups of women that enable us to see both what is in common as well as appreciate what is difference in things like the institutions of and the experiences of mothering, the institutions of and the experiences of sexuality, so on and so forth. All of these things that we, in the earlier wave of feminism, identified as important markers to look at in terms of feminism, which have been importantly complicated by more recent work, including postmodern work. But the importance is we aren't fragmented in ways that make it impossible for us to find lines of connection in terms of both similarities and differences between us. Okay? So that's basically how I'd respond.
Can men be feminists too on this account?
But yeah, sure. Yeah. There's no biological essentialism. I mean, the best way to answer your question is the answer I'm actually going to steal from Sandra Harding in her book. She argues that it's absolutely ridiculous, this isn't her word, this is mine, for us, women who are feminists, to claim that I, as a white, raised working class woman, can understand, and to use Maria Lugones's term, empathetically world travel to the world of a woman of color. If you, as a man, a white man, can't empathetically travel to the world of me as a white woman, okay? So just as I can understand a womanist perspective, and to that extent, and embrace it, to that extent you can understand and embrace a feminist perspective. It does not mean that your experiences, the phenomenology of feminism will be the same for us, but the phenomenology of feminism is not the same for me and for many other women in this classroom, because of differences in our life. So that's how I would answer the question. Also, I want to make it really clear that it isn't only feminists who are doing some of this kind of epistemological work, but interestingly, the non-feminists who are doing it are traditionally coming from epistemologies that are not mainstream. They're coming either from Marxist perspectives or they're coming out of continental traditions, primarily right now either Foucault or Heidegger. So there's, it's interesting, the intersections, and we need to think about that. I just give it to you as a provocative thing to think about, and I'll let you figure out the significance. Well, thank you for all of your very interesting questions.
live around.